and gentlemen, welcome. Thank you to inno4sd for the invitation to come and speak about what we're doing in the e-waste sector in this country. And I do hope that being last is not going to be being least, and that you will find it interesting. E-WASA is a non-profit organization that was established in 2010. It's the oldest serving e-waste association in South Africa. E-WASA stands for the E-Waste Association of South Africa. It was formed by Mr. Keith Anderson with funding from EMPA in Switzerland and SECO, and there was quite a bit of international collaboration in forming the association. And through that, it does enjoy quite a little bit of authority within the sector, within government, within the corporate sector in this country. So we are aiming to actually bring a little bit more formality into e-waste management in South Africa, and see if we can really just get this circular economy kick-started within the e-waste sector. I'm not going to dwell too much on the differences between the linear and the circular economy, because I think those are all areas that you're all fully aware of. But obviously, South Africa has been traditionally a throwaway society with a linear economy. As soon as something new came out, people bought it and they just threw the old one away. And then eventually things started changing, and mobile phones are typically a good example. You buy one today, and when the next version comes out, you upgrade and you give that one to your child, and then it passes down the line right down to possibly the domestic person working for you, and ends up in the rural areas, and that's where it gets stuck. Traditionally, and I'm quoting from quite a few presenters that I've heard talk in the past, the African culture is very much based on a circular economy. If you want to see a plastic bucket disappear, put it on your sidewalk, and I promise you it'll go and it'll be reused until it is completely messed up and there's no more use for it. So it seems to be a natural thing on this continent to actually reuse things. But the digital divide has also brought about quite a challenge. And I think part of the challenge is the deferred dumping, as we call it, from the developed countries into the developing countries like Africa, and the developed countries like South Africa. However, I represented South Africa in El Salvador at the E-Waste Academy Management Edition in 2014, and I was very pleasantly surprised at the level of ability that we've got worldwide or globally in terms of our ability to recycle electronic waste in this country. And that came from one of the companies that I worked for. It is traditionally known as the biggest and the best recycler in this country, and one of the multinational OEMs that manufacture computers. They did the national take-back scheme here, and we were told that globally that company was the best e-waste recycler they had throughout the world. So having said that, let's move on to some of the overview of what's going on in the country. If you have a look there, currently South Africa generates around 2 million tons of WEEE, or waste electronic and electrical equipment that's placed on market per annum, of which only 7 to 10% is recycled. That is made up of what we call Tier 4 and Tier 3 recyclers, who would approximately account for 12% of that volume. Tier 4 being your informal waste pickers. We've heard the informal sector being bandied about quite a bit today, and they do remain the largest footprint available on the continent in terms of actually bringing in the WEEE into formal recycling centers. And then Tier 2 accounts for approximately 7 to 9%. with absolutely no cradle-to-cradle recycling taking place in South Africa. So there's nowhere in this country that someone can take printed wire boards or PC boards as we know them and extract the precious metals or the rare earth metals out of them. Everything gets sent out of the country into Europe or into America for final processing, and that way we're exporting metals, revenue, jobs, etc. So the government has declared war on e-waste, and there's been, Professor Godfrey alluded to the Pakisa. I was actually on that Pakisa for all 5 weeks of the Pakisa, and they are really looking at some initiatives to kickstart the e-waste industry in this country and really just get it a lot more formalized. Then the balance of WEEE is ending up illegally on landfill sites, and that's what we don't want. Going on to the informal practices, informal recycling is taking place as follows, and I'm sure a lot of you have either seen or heard of Agbok Bloshi in Ghana, in Accra. It is known as the e-waste capital of the world. It's horrific to see what those people do and the health issues that are coming out of that, etc. And we're not free from that in South Africa. We went on the Pakisa, in fact, went to one of the landfill sites here in Pretoria, and they showed us where everything was being done very nicely and formally, and I actually saw as we drove in the bus the areas where they'd been burning the copper cable at night, which is hidden away from sight, because they burn the copper cable to get the copper out, and obviously those PVC sheaths and stuff release all the, whatever those hexavalents and funny things that they release that are highly toxic. Then cherry picking is a massive problem. So typically a household owner will have an old CRT monitor, the big monitors, the big TVs, and they'd put them out on the sidewalk and the waste picker would come past, he'd pick it up, smash it on the ground, and he'd pull out the printed circuit board and break off the copper yoke and just dump the rest wherever he finds it, or just leave it lying there. So that is a big problem. Dumping of the cost negative fractions that I was referring to, and this is resultant in poor health conditions to the environment and to human beings, obviously. Compliance in South Africa is a very big issue at the moment because it's very expensive. So we're sitting with two scenarios. We're having a lot of OEMs that are bringing goods and placing them in the market, but they do have extended producer responsibility, so they're supposed to see to it that their products are recycled at the end of life. So what do? They go out, they have a look at what's available in country, and they will take what's more or less the best situation in country and accept that. But that brings a lot of challenges, because they come to a more formal recycling facility and say, well, you've a lot more formalized, you now need to do X, Y, and Z. And with our current National Environmental Management Waste Act and the trigger volumes and things, that company suddenly gets to a point where its volumes are exceeded, the trigger volumes exceed the legislation, and they need a waste license, they need an environmental impact assessment, and the list just grows and grows. Whereby currently South African companies that are formal probably pay anything up to R1 million a year just for compliance. And they don't get that money back in terms of being paid for the recycling, because extended producer responsibility, or what you may know as an advanced recycling fee in Europe, is still nothing that is materialized or real in this country. We are, however, working on a system to see if we can fix that, whereby there will be a call for an industry waste management plan by the Minister of the Department of Environmental Affairs, which we hope to then have a system where we can implement extended producer responsibility in terms of a fee or a levy or whatever it is, in order to help to develop these things. Formal recycling is still very small in this country. I think there's only between 12 and 25 companies that are really properly formalized in South Africa that do e-waste recycling. and they account for the 7 to 9% that I was talking about earlier on. Logistics are very problematic because the country is very big. It costs a lot of money to transport these things around. Then lack of compliance and chain of custody, extremely high cost of compliance I've already mentioned. What we're doing as an association, we are looking at rolling out an international standard based on one of the European standards, which would be adaptable to South Africa in terms of norms and standards, because part of the government mandate is to set new jobs, create new jobs in SMMEs, and also new jobs in the recycling sector of e-waste. And the problem is with that high cost of compliance, it's a barrier to entry. You can't get these people to come in. So we're looking at putting in a set of norms and standards, which those people would then join E-WASA so that we can be playing the regulatory body as best as we can and be the go-between between government and the industry. So we can push back at industry if necessary or push back at government and just ensure a level playing field. And that will help us to establish these people, get them going, and then give them milestones so that we force them to grow their businesses. They start off as a collector on tier 4, and they can go right up to a tier 1 business over a number of years with the proper mentorship, the proper support, the proper training, opening doors for funding, etc. Legislation, I just touched on that very, very briefly. The legal framework in this country is not e-waste specific, so what they do is they use the precautionary principle and they define electronic waste as hazardous waste. Yes, there are elements of hazardous elements within the makeup of a device, but as this laptop is here in front of me, it's not hazardous. I have to take it apart and I have to take a specific component of it and change the state of that component before it becomes a hazardous product. So what we've suggested in the PAKISA is that they adopt this norms and standards that we're looking at and some of the other associations so that we can see if there's a way that we can just make it a lot easier for these people to actually get into the industry, proper norms and standards, best practice, and we can facilitate all this through the association of E-WASA or one of the other associations. There are also very large quantities of legacy stock in government and government warehouses. Now, the reason for that is twofold. Cyber warfare is a huge issue globally at the moment, and there's no ways that the current formal recyclers are even interested in doing data sanitization because it's very costly. There are some companies that have formed solutions where they go on site and they crush hard drives and things like that on site, but again, it comes with its own problems. So if we can come up with a set of norms and standards that is going to help government define how they're going to manage their electronic waste, we can actually do something about it. And the idea behind this in the PAKISA that we were on was that once that is organized, we can start releasing that waste to the small SMMEs that we're going to be setting up across the country. That will help them to get the volumes that they need. And a rough estimate that we made at the time was about 50,000 tons of e-waste that's lying stockpiled in rooms bigger than this, from the floor to the ceiling, full of computers and computer equipment and old stuff. So it's just one of the challenges that we need to address in South Africa. I'm not going to harp too much on the executive summary other than e-waste is still not fully recognized in the broader discussion in the green economy because there's quite a big disconnect between industry and government. Then the issues around the tire thing that we had, Rhodesa, I don't know if you know about the tire plan, industry waste management plan, where the collection of the money, there was an issue around that and money wasn't going back into the industry to develop the industry the way it should have been. And what happened was, when we've been talking about this industry waste management plan for quite some time, and it's just a little bit of background. So what happened was that government didn't want industry to manage this as a voluntary plan. They wanted to collect money via the government into treasury and disperse it through the Department of Environmental Affairs, which brings about quite a lot of challenges, because once the money goes into the treasury, it then just disappears into a bottomless pit, cannot be ring-fenced, and we cannot get access to it. So we said we will manage it voluntarily with a product responsibility organization that gets chosen, whoever's plan gets chosen, and they can have representation on the board of that company, and they can actually manage this thing properly. And there's been a little bit of a hiccup around that, but we believe that this will now possibly take place in the new year, which will help to formalize the industry, because the other side of that is the PRO will have to have OEMs registering on it and the recyclers and the refurbishers. I've heard quite a few people mentioning about the Chinese problem. We have an issue with a lot of Chinese imports just getting dumped in this country, and no one knows what to do with them because they don't register, they bring the stuff in illegally, etc., etc. So that is a big problem. However, we feel that with all of these discussions, we're getting to the point where this will become a reality shortly, and it'll help to formalize the industry, coupled to what we're busy with at the moment. I'm not going to go through the waste hierarchy. I think it's been bandied about a few times today. I've dealt with a snapshot of the situation, but part of it, as I said, was the informal recycling. Then we have an issue around a lack of adequate infrastructure to deal with the growing volumes of e-waste. Disposal of landfill is still the dominant means of e-waste management, believe it or not. Low levels of recycling is largely carried out by the informal sector and the private sector. Fully compliant and formal recycling is very small. Illegal dumping through cherry picking, legacy stock in government, and then the other big one is the lack of capacity to deal with WEEE management issues and the suitable regulatory framework. When we have a look at this slide, you see the bottom of the pyramid. The complexity of the e-waste problem is very big. I mentioned the industry waste management plan. We need to have the plan adopted to get it into play so that we can start getting the process resolved quicker and more formal. The evaluation and implementation processes will help us to get to the point where we can get these enterprises up and running and educate and train the people, because that's the next problem is the education and training. There's a lot of people working in these industries that have been working, some of them up to 20 years, and they still have no formal qualification. So they cannot leave that company and go to the next one that starts up because they don't have a qualification to say, this is what I'm able to do, and they get exploited quite badly for that as well. SMME and enterprise and job creation would then come about as part of this, and finally the beneficiation to recover the precious metals in-house in South Africa. The circular economy model for South Africa, I'm not going to harp on that. We've spoken about that quite a few times today. I just want to focus a little bit more on this quickly. As an organization, E-WASA is looking at the following areas where we're going to make a difference, or where we are busy making a difference. In education, we're looking at in national qualification levels 2 to 8, whereby we'll enable learners to go and get proper qualifications and accredited qualifications in order to participate in the sector in terms of finding work and jobs, or actually being chosen to set up SMMEs. Enterprise development, we've got a goal to set 10,000 new jobs over the real jobs and sustainable jobs over the next 5 years, inclusive of all the townships locally, because there's a very big footprint in terms of e-waste in every single township in this country, other than our normal metropolitan areas. And then eligibility, after the training, they become eligible for selection for these businesses, and then training of the candidates by the universities of technology on a national basis. I just briefly spoke of the tiered system, tier 4 informal collection facilities, or informal collectors, waste pickers, Tier 3 buyback centers and drop-off points with some light dismantling, and then Tier 2 would be more formalized dismantling with no beneficiation, and Tier 1 would be final beneficiation. Close collaboration between the metros, municipalities, and E-WASA will ensure transparency. We've spoken about transparency today, and world-class e-waste management projects will be realized out of this, ensuring real and sustainable socio-economic projects throughout South Africa to be birthed and handed over at the end of the mentorship phase, which would typically be 5 years from the implementation phase. Then we're currently very excited on some local technology that we've found, that we are looking at the beneficiation of the metals, and we're looking at some partnerships between E-WASA, government, some very big multinational OEMs, and different beneficiation facilities in South Africa to do the metal beneficiation, job creation further down the value chain, skills transfers, local broad-based black economic empowerment, ownership of the raw materials, the secondary raw materials, and then local technology development, which we can then export into Africa and possibly the rest of the world. And then finally, just to speak about something that Lauren spoke about earlier on, we're looking at the E-WASA Africa WEEE Forum, where we want to have a Cape to Cairo solution, where we can have standards, whatever we apply here, we can help to set up throughout the continent of Africa and work in close collaboration with the African community in order to resolve the e-waste problem on the continental basis. And that's me. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Malcolm, for that focused presentation on e-waste management in South Africa. With this, we have seen the whole value chain from material extraction, with specific examples from Ghana, down to waste collection related to e-waste in South Africa. So we don't have much time, but we could take a couple of questions. I know you are all tired, we are all tired, but I think it has been a very interesting panel with different presentations that could be, yes, please. Well.
Hi, yeah, Will McDowell from UCL. I was just interested with that last point about the WEEE forum, continental-wide, and I was just wondering to what extent E-WASA is networked with similar organizations elsewhere in Africa and also in other developing parts of the world. So to what extent you're able to facilitate the processes of knowledge transfer between African countries and perhaps also other parts of the world, and to what extent those links exist or perhaps aren't there yet.
We have tested the idea with a couple of countries, Nigeria and Ghana, and then we've spoken to some of our European colleagues from STEP and from the United Nations University, and they all seem to be quite keen to explore this further. It's a new concept that we've just launched recently, and there's definitely been quite a bit of uptake in terms of the interest in doing something with it.
Okay, thank you. Any further question? Yeah, I have one very small one, but I think it's relevant for three of you, which is that if can innovation be enforced? Because we have seen many examples here of legislations that couldn't be, for different reasons, actually fulfilled, and many of those were directly related to innovation actions, to innovative actions. So there's, a debate. I've heard different times during these days people reflecting about these enforcement issues. So what would be your opinion on this, very briefly, because we have to really close.
If I can just kick off with that one, I think the big thing is just to give you an idea is a lot of the informal people are not really interested in formality because we've mentioned it today, they want a roof over their heads and they want food to eat tonight. But because of the exploitation of the informal structure of the whole sector, they're being exploited and they've been marginalized. So if we put in a bit more of an innovative structure whereby they're getting paid directly through a system that they're part of, they're going to be benefiting financially a lot more. And I think from an innovative way, that is the only way we're going to really make it work. So I think there's definitely place for innovation there.
Okay, I have a much more kind of philosophical answer, probably a personal one rather than an official one. I think what strikes me is where I have seen change, it's fundamentally about people and about the will for change. So coming to your question about can it be enforced, I would say no. I think it needs to be enabled. And I think that a lot of where I have seen true innovation is it's about things that are disparate suddenly coming together. So forums such as these, where we bring different people, it's trying to find people that think differently from ourselves. And as much as we are quite a diverse, we are still the green economy group, and you see all the same people. So I think it's trying to introduce more diversity, almost more serendipity, and fundamentally will, finding people with the courage to drive things. So I would say don't enforce, enable.
Right, so I really like that point. I work in an academic institution, so I'm also quite philosophical in some of my thinking. But I think I agree, because in the idea of enforcement in there is force, right? So the usage of force has not really made it possible for some of these regulations to work. As I was giving an example of the artisanal small-scale mining industry in Ghana. But I also think on the other side, on the other hand, that innovation can work. And I gave an example of the usage of magnets, which is very basic. And I think some of these basic ones, I think that we should take baby steps in some cases. And how it would work is when we engage with some of these stakeholders, most of them that are really at the forefront of these informal, at least in my context, these types of informal economies. And if we engage with them and they find it to be useful and they see that, we weigh the cost and benefit, and it's actually benefiting them more than, costing them anything, then it could have an impact.
Okay, thank you. So with this, I would close the session. I think we have already a good takeaway message for the plenary. So thank you all for, sorry, there's one additional question.
My question is on the international standard that E-WASA is rolling out. How does it relate to the ISO 14000, or is it customized for the South African situation, although it's international standard?
It basically talks to the ISO 14000 standard, but it is an internationally accepted standard within e-waste management, and we're just looking at the salient points to customize it, because we're fully aware of the ISO 14001 being the standard required here, and just to make it easier, so we will take points out of that will address those issues. But it's about good practice and bad practice, typically, if that answers.
Okay, so thank you all of you for being here, and see you later in the plenary.